Hello there, and welcome to my guide for painting Marvel Zombies, Jonah Jameson, and Ben Urich. As you can see, I've sprayed Ben with some matte white from Colourforge and JJ with some matte black from Colourforge. I'm going to start with Ben, and I'm going to start with his trousers, and for that I'm going to use some Nurgling Green. And this will get a wash with some Athonian Camo shade. And while that dries, we'll start on JJ's trousers, and I'm going to use some Dawnstone for that. This might take a couple of coats because we are painting on black. His trousers will then get a wash with some Nuln Oil. Once the wash has dried on Ben, we're going to relayer the Nurgling Green with some Nurgling Green. Try to avoid the recesses because that's where we want to keep all that lovely shading. I'm then going to do a 50-50 mix of Nurgling Green and matte white for the highlight. I'm then going to move back to JJ, and I'm going to relayer his trousers with some Dawnstone, and I'm going to avoid all those recesses once again. For the highlight, I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of Dawnstone and Grey Sear. I'm then going to use some Grey Sear to paint Ben's shirt. This will be followed by the first highlight, which is a 50-50 mix of Grey Sear and matte white, which will be then followed by the final highlight of matte white just by its lonesome. For Ben's coat, I'm going to paint it with some Xandri dust. This will then receive a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. While that dries, we're going to work on JJ's white shirt, but for that we're going to paint it a little differently, and I'm going to use some Wraithbone for the base coat. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and matte white, before a final highlight of matte white just by itself. Then I'm going to move back to Ben's jacket, and I'm going to use Xandri dust once again just to relayer and neaten everything up. This will then be followed by a highlight of Xandri dust mixed with some Carrick Stone for a 50-50 ratio. And then finally Carrick Stone just by itself for the final highlight. Then I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to very carefully paint Ben's tie, phone, belt, and shoes. I'm also going to paint JJ's belt as well as neaten up his waistcoat and his tie too. I'm then going to subtly highlight all these areas with some Corvus Black. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Corvus Black and Eshin Grey for the final highlight. For both belt buckles, I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel. Then I'm going to use a couple of coats of matte white to paint the Daily Bugle newspaper in JJ's hands. Then I'm going to very carefully use some Nuln Oil to actually fill in the lines where the writing would be. On the front there's a picture of Spider-Man that's actually embossed, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some Blood Angels Red contrast paint just to paint that in place. Spider-Man's suit also has some blue, and for that I'm going to use some Achelian Green. Now it's finally time to start the skin, and for that I'm going to use some Bugman's Glow, followed by a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. Once that wash has dried, we're then going to go in and relayer the Bugman's Glow. Remember to avoid any of the recesses. Then I'm going to start on the eyes, and for that I'm going to use a little bit of Abaddon Black and very carefully mark out where the eye would be. This will be followed by some matte white. And then finally a little dot of Abaddon Black for the pupil. Then we'll continue with the skin, and for that we're going to do a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone, followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. Then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh, followed by a final highlight of Kislev Flesh. This is just basically on like the tips of the fingers and the edges of knuckles and things like that, just to help them stand out a little. Then we're going to move back to Ben, and we're going to use some Iron Hand Steel to mark in his glasses. And for the lenses, so it looks like it's reflecting some light, we're going to use some matte white. Then I'm going to very carefully paint in JJ's mustache using some Abaddon Black, and I'm also going to neaten up his hair as well. He's got some grey on his temples, so for that we're going to mix in some Grey Sear to Abaddon Black for about a 50-50 ratio. And then this will be highlighted just using some Grey Sear. Ben's hair will get a coat of Mournfang Brown, followed by a wash of Agrax Earthshade. Now we're ready to move on to the bases, and for JJ's wooden floor we're going to use some dryad bark to begin with, which will then get a dry brush with some rakarth flesh. Ben's will get a coat of dawnstone, which will be given a dry brush with some grey cere. The yellow road marking will get painted with some Flash Gits yellow. And then I'll use matte white to paint the paper that's on the floor. Then I'll use Abaddon black to tidy up the rims, before finally using a coat of watered down Agrax Earthshade. Once that wash is dry, that's both those miniatures complete. Now, JJ comes in the actual core box of Marvel Zombies, but the only way to pick up Ben is if you actually back the Kickstarter. So it might be a little bit difficult to pick him up. Both these models were really enjoyable to paint, and overall they only took about 4 hours. Come on, really knocked it out of the park with these guys, as they normally do with their box sets, and these guys will actually come in handy for Marvel Crisis Protocol if you need civilians or people to rescue. As ever, thank you so much for watching. If you found this guide useful, give us a thumbs up and maybe a share, and think about subscribing. Thanks once again, and I will see you next time. Goodbye for now.